Hi, I'm Maria from Nancy's Notions. Today I'm going to talk about some easy finishes for your quilt projects. We're going to create some double fold binding, and I'm going to show you how to get perfect mitered corners. And I'm also going to show you how to create a rod pocket to go on the back of your project so that you can hang it if you'd like. So come with me and let's get binding. Here I've gathered some of the tools I'm going to need to create the double fold binding. I have the Binding Buddy 2.5 inch ruler. It is 2.5 inches wide and long enough to stretch across my fabric, folded in half on my cutting mat. And it has this great 45-degree angle cut on the end that I'm going to use to mark for my stitching the strips together so I can get all the way around my quilt. The seams right gauge, I'm going to use this 1/4 inch mark here to show where I need to stop stitching in the corners. Some pins are always handy to hold your fabric strips where you want them. A marking pen and a rotary cutter to go along with the ruler and the mat. So here I have a piece of black fabric that I'm going to use to create the binding so that it looks like my sample behind me. To determine how many strips you need, you have to do some simple math. Measure across the top of your project and down one side. Multiply that number by 2. Divide it by 40 inches, which is a little bit shorter than what the width of this fabric is. And add a couple inches, and I've got plenty of fabric to do the seams, to come around the corners, and to do a finishing seam at the end of my quilt. I've taken and put the selvage edges together to fold the fabric in half, and because of the size of my mat, I'm going to fold it one more time. And I like to leave a little space here, and I'm going to line that up on my mat so that it's going straight across. Take my ruler and lay it on this right side edge, following the grid mark along the mat, and my rotary cutter, clean up that little edge. Now I'm going to flip it around because I like to cut on the right hand side. Line up those edges again and line up on the straight line of my grid. Here's my 2.5 inch strip. You can measure it on the mat if you'd like to, but this ruler is the perfect width for it, so I don't need to do any more worrying about what's underneath here now that I have a clean side to work on. I like to pull them away just a little bit so I can see that raw edge clearly. Now, because my binding is black, that's a little hard to see on camera, so we're going to use 2 strips just to show you the process that I use to get my pieces all put together, but this way you can see a little bit more clearly what I'm doing. I've got a printed black piece here, and I've got this lovely piece of tan. I'm going to flip it over to the wrong side, use this angled end of my ruler. You can either cut across the end, or you can do like I like to, which is draw a line for my stitching. And because of that little angled piece on the end, which you can use to cut off the tails so they don't get caught up in the binding, I'm going to use it to extend my stitching line across there. Now, use your mat again to line these strips up perpendicular to each other, which means you're going to make a little plus sign here. I've got my black batik along these lines, and I'm going to take my tan and lay it right on top here, and look at how that line lines up with the top edge of my black and the bottom edge of my black. Take a couple pins to hold them together and head to the sewing machine. I'm over at the machine. I'm going to put that line right under the needle and stitch from end to end. I don't go back and forth to do a locking stitch because that adds bulk to your seam, and I don't want any bulk in my binding. Plus, this is going to be nestled in against the quilt, so you don't really need to worry about tying it off. I have stitched along that diagonal line. The next step is to go back to your cutting mat, and you're going to trim off this extra fabric. I like to give myself a 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch away from the stitching. Clean up the top, and then I'm going to go to the iron and press that seam open to further distribute the bulk in my binding. I am trimmed, it's been pressed open, and I have this lovely, flat, smooth finish in my seams. Now, one more step before I go and fold my binding in half, creating that double fold effect. I'm going to flip the ruler over upside down, and I need this diagonal line here for when I finish up later on. I'll take my pen, mark again, and take my rotary cutter and trim this off. Give it a press, folding over a good 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch here. I want just a little bit more because of the fusing technique I'm going to show you. I'm going to use some easy steam-a-seam. I need a little piece of this steam-a-seam tape, and it's a little bit sticky on one side and it's paper backed on the other, so I can stick it in place, leave the paper on until I'm ready to peel it off later so I don't get stuck to other surfaces. And it's going to help me tuck in the tail end of the binding at the end of this process. Give it a little crease with my finger, cut off the extra. Now I'm going to travel back over to the ironing board, and I'm going to take this strip, fold it in half, all the way down the length of my strips so that it still reaches around my quilt project. And you can see this little tip at the end here has sort of an open triangle look to it. That's exactly what I want. Now that you've got the idea of how to assemble those strips all together, I've gone back to my black binding to match the sample that you see behind me. I have the end trimmed and my piece of fusible tape on there. And I've also taken one of those extra cardboard pieces that end up in your sewing room and wound the binding around it to just keep it in one spot and help keep it from getting wrinkled before I put it onto my quilt. So now let's go back to our wall hanging. I'm going to use my Binding Buddy ruler again to clean up the edge of my quilt. So I'm going to just line it up on the edge of my border strip, take my rotary cutter, run it along there to get rid of this extra backing and batting that are around the quilt. Now I've got the backing and batting trimmed away. I'm going to keep one of these pieces to create my rod pocket because it's left over from the backing. It's going to match what goes back here, and then I don't have a scrap to put away. Now I'm going to show you a very easy way to create a rod pocket. I'm taking the leftover from my backing that I trimmed off before. I'm going to lay it on my cutting mat. I'm going to take the edge, top edge of my quilt. You don't want to do the side because then it would hang sideways. Top edge, line it up along the edge with the selvage here. I'm going to just pin it together for just a moment. I'm using the flower head pins, and I love them because they are so long from the head of the pin, which is a flat flower, to the tip, and I don't need quite as many either because of their length. I'm going to take my rotary cutter and carefully trim right along the edge of my quilt. You can get your ruler back out if you'd like to. And I now have a strip that is the same width, but when I fold a 1/2 inch hem over on both ends, it's going to tuck in just perfect width from edge to edge so that it gives room for that rod pocket, and it's going to hold my quilt nice and straight on the wall. Now I'm going to fold this piece in half just to fit on my mat for no other reason. And I'm going to cut myself a 6-inch wide strip to use for that rod pocket. If your rod that you're hanging it on is much larger than a 2.5 inch wide rod, then you're going to want to adjust the width of this strip to accommodate your hanging system. Again, I can use my Binding Buddy ruler that I already have out. And move myself down 6 inches. Cut it again. And I'm going to go to the iron and fold it over about 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch. It's perfect. Press that and stitch that in place, and then we'll fold it in half. And this is ready for application when we get to that point. Now for the fun part, let's finish up. I'm going to start at the bottom of my quilt because that's my preference. It really doesn't matter if you start on a side or the top or the bottom, but you need to choose a place to start stitching. I have put the little foot on the machine, which gives me a great 1/4 inch seam allowance from needle to the edge of the foot, so I don't have to do any measuring or anything like that as I'm applying my binding. Not only is it a 1/4 inch from the needle to the edge, but it has red marks on here that from this mark here to the one in front is another 1/4 of an inch marking. So as I come to the edge of my quilt, I know right where to stop. To get started, I'm going to open up my binding, so I'm only catching this bottom layer for just a few inches. And then I'm going to pull it away from the machine, fold that binding back over and continue. My reason is because I need this open to tuck the tail in when I come around the quilt and back to where I started. That's about far enough, so I'm going to fold it over, just pulled it away a little bit, and I'm going to stitch on. Now my red line is lined up with the edge of my quilt. I'm going to stop here, backtrack a couple stitches, cut my thread. If you don't have this foot and you've just got your regular sewing foot on there, you can use your gauge that has a 1/4 inch square colored out here. If I lay that on the edge of the quilt, I need to stop stitching. Here's the edge just inside here. Here's the edge lined up here. That's exactly where I want to stop in order to turn the corner. At this point, I'm going to fold my binding. I like to say up and away from my quilt or out and away, depending which way I've got it turned. I'm going to create a 45-degree crease right here. And I'm also going to continue the straight line from the edge of my quilt up my binding. If you've got it turned so far that you're forming an angle, you've folded it too far. If you're angling out, you haven't folded it far enough. So it needs to be a square corner or a right corner, 90-degree corner, however you want to say it. My straight strip, up and away from my quilt. And here's my nice 45-degree line. Now I'm going to take the same strip, fold it back over the quilt, lining up the fold here with the raw edge that I just stitched. And I'm going to start stitching right here in this corner and continue down to the next corner. Get that corner back under the machine. I like to backtrack there just to anchor that nice and tight. When I get to the next corner, I'm going to do that same folding technique. So 3 more times after this, and then we're going to come up to the tail end where we started. One more little tip to give you: be careful that you don't overstretch as you're sewing. Stitch a few inches, stop, readjust your hands so you're still on top of the table of your machine. It will help keep that binding stitching a lot straighter than what maybe you've had before. Now that I'm back to where I started, I'm going to take my scissor and just trim off the tail end of this. I want to make sure I'm past this fold, or else I'm going to have a hole in my binding. So right about here is great. And I'm going to go in here and peel this piece of tape off. So I'm going to open that up just a bit, lay my tail end down right on top of it, and fold it over. And I have what I like to call a faux seam in place there that I'm now going to continue stitching and end up back where I started. After I've stitched, I'm going to go to the iron and iron this down to make it more permanent. I've stitched all the way around. I've got these nice fish fins or 45-degree folds created in each corner. If I flip my quilt over so I'm looking at the back side, I'm going to take that rod pocket that we created before. Remember, we folded in both edges and stitched it down, and I've pressed it in half. I'm going to line up these raw edges with the raw edge at the top of my quilt. Let's check our words. Yep, we're at the top. Just like this. Give it a couple of pins to hold it in place. There are many different ways to do this. This, I think, works one of the slickest. Put it back under the machine, and I'm going to stitch a scant 1/4 of an inch away from this raw edge. I don't necessarily have to hit this stitching again because we're going to do one more stitching after we get this pocket in place. So you just need to get it basted on there to hold it still. And when I'm done turning my binding to the back side or around the edges, I'm going to come back and just do a quick little hand whip stitch to hold this end of my rod pocket down. And I've just created an area for your rod or your stick to go through to hang your quilt up on the wall. I'm ready to finish. I've gone back to my sewing drawer and pulled out my binding clips. The really nice thing about these is that the back edge and the front red curve here line up. So when I clip them to my binding around the quilt, I can clip them where I also want to stitch and just follow along from edge to edge on my clips. I'm going to take the iron and press where the tape was, where I started and stopped, to make sure that's hooked in nice and good. I also like to run the iron along the whole edge of my quilt, especially where those corners are. It helps crease in my mitered corners. And then I come back, fold that binding away from the quilt, and give it another little pressing here. It makes for a nice, clean, smooth edge. You see how nice this is laying compared to how this is still a little bit folded over the top of my quilt. Now that I've gone and pressed all the way around my quilt, I'm coming back to an edge somewhere. You have to start somewhere, and I'm going to take what was rolled to the top and wrap it all the way around to the back. Here's the corner where I turned. I'm going to do one side, add a clip, and I'm going to stay right on the edge of that binding so I have a stitching guide on the opposite side. Here in the corner, taking my finger and pressing down that edge of the quilt just to make it lie flat. You can see here I've got a mitered edge to the quilt here, or the binding. I'm going to fold this part of the binding right over that edge, and I've just formed a mitered tuck on the back side. And you can see on the front, here's your mitered edge right here. I've got it tucked there, and it's tucked back here, and look at that lovely square corner we just created. Work your way all the way around the outer edge of your quilt. If you'd like to go back and machine stitch it, when you go back to the machine, you can stitch right in the well here that's formed between the quilt and your binding strip and finish it off by machine. If you prefer to stitch by hand, I've got it all clipped in place. You can do some fancy stitching or some easy stitching back there. Take the clips off as you go, and you're all done. Even though there are many steps to accomplish this technique, this is something that anyone with any skill level can accomplish. Now is the time to finish off your projects into treasured heirlooms for your own home. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, be sure to hit the like button below and leave us a comment. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe so that you see more videos as they come. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Hello, I'm back. It's like a country chipmunk.